hair smell wafts from the counter. Clockwise clock made of teeth and bone. My thumb hovers over the delete key. The screen, S-glow reflecting in the rain. Streaked window like a bruised plum. The text message burns in my mind. Found this in the crawl space. 1867. You're the one holding the lantern. Asterisk, not me. Not possible. I smash the delete button, the keyboard clacking like frantic insect legs. Hooray, not me. Asterisk, I type it again on the manual typewriter. Clack, 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 clack. Each letter a hammer blow to the impossible. Who? Not me. Asterisk, the sound is sharp, metallic, cutting through the cabin. A suppressive silence. I grab the typewriter by its cold metal base. The keys like shattered glass under my palms. Sphynx. Asterisk, the sound is sudden, violent, a wet crack, a splintering of wood, the typewriter shattering into 1,000 pieces on the floorboards. Splinters embed themselves in my palm. But I don't feel the pain. Only the rain. Torrential black rain pounds the roof like oxidized metal sheets being hammered into place. Pound, pound, pound. Asterisk, each drop hits the tin roof with a sound like a nail being driven into wood. The cabin groans under the weight. I turn away from the wreckage, my eyes drawn to the counter. Clockwise clock. It's as made of petrified dental fragments. Yellowed, cracked, layered like the rings of a fossilized tree. The rain, as rhythm syncs with the clock, as ticking, but it's wrong. The ticks are too slow, too heavy, and then the footsteps begin. Echoing footsteps inside the wall, asterisk not outside, inside the cabin's very bones. They read too loud for the cabinet's size. A heavy, dragging tread that vibrates the floorboards beneath my bare feet. Thud. Bish. Sever to linger in the air, making the rain rhythm stutter. I from the wall toward the window. The rotten, fruit plum light bleeds through the thick, muddy glass, casting everything in a sickly, bruised hue. It is the color of overripe plums left in the sun too long. Purple, then black, then a deep, decaying violet. I see movement in the periphery, a shadow shifting just beyond the window's edge. But when I look directly, it vanishes. Just the rain, just the rain. Repeating it like a mantra, but the words feel hollow, meaningless against the dread coiling in my gut. The footsteps stop, silence. Then a new sound, the clock, as fragments, cracking, not a tick, but a sharp, brittle snap from within the clock, a score. The sound is like a tooth breaking under pressure. I hear it clearly through the cabin. As walls, the rain pounds harder now, a relentless rhythm. Pound, 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 asterisk the clock, as fragments shatter further. A snap, asterisk the cabin feels smaller. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and old blood. I feel the square footage contracting around me, the walls leaning inward, the ceiling lowering. The rotten fruit light bleeds darker, deeper. The footsteps begin again. Forfing footsteps inside the wall, asterisk they, getting closer. The clock, as fragments are all that's left of the counter. Clockwise mechanism, snap. Asterisk the fragments crack as the cabin, square footage contracts. The rain pounds like a hammer, a side pound asterisk the clock. As fragments crack, a snap, asterisk the cabin shrinks, a snap. Asterisk the footsteps echo. Whew, thud, asterisk the cabin, square footage contracts, snap, asterisk the fragments crack, snap, asterisk the rain pounds, whew, pood, asterisk the clock, fragments crack, who snap. Asterisk the cabin shrinks. Snap! Asterisk the footsteps echo inside the wall. Thud! Asterisk the cabin. Square footage contracts. Snap! Asterisk the fragments crack. Snap! Asterisk the rain pounds. 40 pound. Asterisk the clock. As fragments crack. Snap! Asterisk the cabin shrinks. A snap! Asterisk the footsteps echo. A thud! Asterisk the cabin. A square footage contracts. Subby snap! Asterisk the fragments crack. Snap! Asterisk the rain pounds. Fervent pound! Asterisk the clock! As fragments crack! A snap! Asterisk the cabin shrinks! A snap! Asterisk the footsteps echo! A thuathud! Asterisk the cabin square footage contracts. Snap! Asterisk the fragments crack! Snap! Asterisk the rain pounds! Some been decound. Asterisk the clock fragments crack. Snap! Asterisk the footsteps echo. Thud! Asterisk the cabin. Square footage contracts. Snap! Asterisk the fragments crack. Snap! Asterisk the rain pounds. 3 pound. Asterisk the clock. As fragments crack. Snap! Asterisk the cabin shrinks. Snap! Asterisk the footsteps echo. Thud. Asterisk the cabin. Square footage contracts. Snap! Asterisk the fragments crack. The text arrived as a tremor in the silence, a new message burning into the screen's bruised plum reflection. The mirror's emulsion is shifting. I didn't need to look. I knew. The silver surface felt wrong under my gaze, a viscous heat radiating from its depths. I forced myself to turn, the rain hammering against the window like a frantic drumbeat. The rotten fruit light, a sickly violet, bled deeper into the cabin, staining everything in a decaying hue. The mirror! It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a window, a portal, something else. The emulsion, the thin layer of silver that gave it its reflective properties, wasn't smooth anymore. It rippled like disturbed water, the surface fractured into 1,000 tiny shifting planes. I saw it then, a glimpse of something tween ills, something not meant for this reality. My own death, laid bare in the distorted reflections, a decaying tableau of bone and ruin. The image lingered for a heartbeat, then vanished, leaving a residue of nausea and a metallic tang on my tongue. My cat, Silas, a mangy sphynx scarred with ritualistic markings, padded closer, his purr a low rumble against the rising storm. His purr always a prophetic cadence, a subtle shift in the world's hum was now fractured. The rhythm was broken, a discordant pulse against the rain's relentless pounding. It felt like a warning, a desperate attempt to anchor me to this reality. The scars on his skin, intricate patterns of raised, silvery lines, seemed to shimmer in the mirror's distorted light. The rain tasted like wet parchment, a strange, musty flavor coating my tongue. I hadn't noticed it before, hadn't registered the taste of the rain, but now it was undeniable, an intrusion of the unnatural. The scent of wet earth and old blood intensified, clinging to the back of my throat, a suffocating presence. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing inward, the ceiling lowering, a sensation of being squeezed, of being compressed, like a specimen pinned beneath glass. I turned back to the mirror. It sucked. Not a visual pull, but a physical force, a subtle vacuum drawing something from the room. I watched, paralyzed, as the mangy sphinx's jawline, the sharp angle of his cheekbone began to blur, to waver within the mirror's depths. The scars, the intricate patterns that marked his skin dissolved into the shifting emulsion, becoming part of the distorted image, a silent, agonizing consumption. The air, if it could be called air, grew thick and heavy, pressing against my lungs. The metallic rasp of fur, a familiar comfort, vanished as Silas's form began to fade, his essence drawn into the mirror's hungry surface. A wave of dizziness washed over me, a disorientation that threatened to unravel my very being. I gripped the edge of the table, the wood rough and splintered beneath my fingers. The rain hammered against the roof, a relentless, deafening barrage. Twee-pound, pound, pound, the sound resonated through the cabin, vibrating in my bones. It wasn't just rain anymore. It was a physical assault. I wanted to cover my ears, to shut out the noise, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The light deepened, the violet deepening into an oppressive black, swallowing the cabin in shadow. I forced myself to focus on Silas, on the fading image of his scarred face. His purr, once a reassuring cadence, was now a broken, fragmented echo. The prophetic rhythm was gone, replaced by a chaotic dissonance that threatened to shatter my sanity. I tried to reach out, to pull him back, but my hand passed through the mirror's surface as if it were smoke. The last vestige of his form vanished into the emulsion. The scar, the last trace of his presence, dissolved into the shifting silver. The purr ceased entirely. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. It was the silence of absence, the silence of something irrevocably lost. I felt a sudden, sickening lurch in my stomach, a feeling of being unmoored, adrift in a sea of nothingness. The world tilted, the cabin spun. I braced myself against the table, the wood digging into my palms. The rain continued its relentless assault. Every pound, pound, pound! The taste of wet parchment lingered on my tongue. The rotten fruit plum light pressed down, a suffocating weight. The cabin shrunk. The world dissolved. The text arrived as a jolt, a new message burning into the screen's bruised plum reflection. 20 cat scars are the anchor. I didn't pass it immediately. The rain was a physical presence, a hammering assault against the cabin walls. Silas, my cat, a mangy sphynx etched with ritualistic silver, shoved himself forward, not away from the mirror as he usually did, but tutti into its path. A low, guttural rumble vibrated in his chest, a tremor against the storm's relentless percussion. He butted my leg, a frantic, insistent pressure. The message pulsed on the screen, mocking my confusion. Cat scars are the anchor! The words felt like a physical weight pressing against my skull. I looked at Silas, at the intricate patterns of raised scars that mapped his skin, the silvery lines shimmering in the mirror's distorted light. They weren't just markings, they were something else, something I couldn't quite grasp. The rain scraped against the cabin, a sound like metal dragged across bone. The rotten fruit plum light deepened, a viscous stain spreading across the walls. The mirror, it wasn't reflecting anymore. It was a window into something elsewhere, something that felt like a tightening coil around my chest. I felt a sudden, sickening wave of vertigo, a disorientation that threatened to pull me under. I gripped the table, the rough wood biting into my palms. Silas's purr, a fractured cadence, uttered, then ceased. The silence that followed was a vacuum, sucking the air from the room. Another text appeared. To Silas. Single stark word, burning into the screen. It felt accusatory, a condemnation. I looked at Silas again. His jawline, normally sharp and defined, wavered, blurring within the mirror's depths. A faint twinkle escaped his mouth, a mechanical sound utterly out of place. The scar patterns on his skin seemed to writhe, to twist, as if alive beneath his thin, grey fur. The rain intensified, a furious metallic rasp against the roof. Scrape, 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 scrape! My peripheral vision flickered. A shadow, a fleeting glimpse of something twin-wrong, danced at the edge of my sight. I turned expecting to see. What? A tree branch thrashing in the wind. But there was nothing, just the relentless rain and the oppressive plum light. I looked back at Silas. He was fading, not disappearing entirely, but dissolving, his essence drawn into the mirror's hungry surface. The mangy fur seemed to unravel, the texture shifting from coarse to something fluid. The air grew heavy, viscous, as if I were submerged in a thick liquid. The metallic rasp of fur vanished, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Silas's eyes, normally a startling, intelligent gold, became dull, vacant pools. I reached out, desperate to pull him back, to anchor him to this reality, but my hand passed through the mirror's surface as if it were smoke. The phantom sensation lingered, a tingling coldness on my fingertips. The text on the screen shifted again, morphing into a single chilling phrase, encore lust. The rain hammered against the window, a deafening, rhythmic pulse, the thump, thump. The taste of wet parchment, that strange, musty flavor, intensified, coating my tongue. It felt like I was consuming the very air I breathed. The cabin seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward, the ceiling lowering. A sense of being compressed, of being crushed, threatened to suffocate me. Silas's purr, once a reassuring cadence, was now a broken, fragmented echo, a discordant pulse against the storm. The prophetic rhythm was gone, replaced by a chaotic dissonance that threatened to unravel my sanity. I saw it then, a fleeting glimpse of my own death reflected in the mirror, not the decaying tableau of bone and ruin from before, but something different. A figure standing over me, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. A predatory stillness, the shadow at the edge of my vision solidified. It wasn't a trick of the light, a fleeting distortion. It was something, a humanoid form, indistinct and shifting, lurking just beyond the periphery. I tried to focus, to bring it into clear view, but it vanished as soon as I turned my head. The cabin spun. The taste of wet parchment intensified, a suffocating presence. The rotten fruit light deepened, a viscous stain spreading across the walls. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against my lungs. The last vestige of Silas vanished into the mirror. The scar, the last trace of his presence, dissolved into the shifting silver. The silence was absolute. I felt a lurch in my stomach, a sickening sensation of being unmoored, adrift in a sea of nothingness. The world tilted, I braced myself against the table, the wood digging into my palms. The rain continued its relentless assault. Thump, thump, thump! Then a final text appeared on the screen. A single chilling word. A name. Clark. Silas's paws reached out, extending towards the mirror's surface, the pads of his feet sinking into the shifting emulsion. He disappeared completely. The lighter's flame was a fragile, trembling thing against the mirror's silvered edge, a thin, yellow-blue flicker, like a dying insect's wings. I held it steady, my fingers numb, the metal surface already beginning to sweat, not with moisture but with something thicker, something that clung like syrup. The hissing started before the burn took hold, a wet, resonant shush that vibrated through my bones, the way a struck-tuning fork hums in the chest. Silas's fur stood on end, the mangy patches of his skin twitching in unison, but he didn't pull away. His eyes, those unnatural gold pools, were locked onto the mirror, not in fear, but in something worse, anticipation. The silver hissed louder now, a sound like air escaping a punctured lung, and the emulsion beneath it began to bubble, not with heat, but with a slow, viscous rise, as if the glass itself were exhaling. The cabin smelled of caramelized sugar, of something burnt and sweet, but beneath that, a deeper rot, the kind that clings to the back of the throat. My stomach lurched. The lighter's flame didn't waver, but the mirror's surface did. It rippled, not from heat, but from something pushing against it from the other side, something that wanted out. The silvered backing groaned, a sound like old leather splitting under strain, and then, crack, a spiderweb of fractures spidered across the glass, not from impact, but from within, as if the mirror were unraveling itself. Silas's purr had been a constant, a low, rhythmic pulse beneath the storm's fury. But now it stuttered, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was tendy-filled, thick with the sound of his absence. The emulsion at the center of the burn began to ooze, a slow, syrupy black that didn't drip but speed bleed, spreading outward in uneven tendrils. It wasn't liquid. It was socialive, shifting, writhing like a nest of worms, and the air above it warped, the heatless heat of a desert mirage. The cabin's walls seemed to breathe, the wood expanding, contracting, the grain splitting apart as if the very structure were trying to exhale. I reached for Silas, but my fingers passed through him. Not ghostly, not insubstantial. One wrong. His form flickered, his edges jagged, like a half-loaded image. The purr had gone. The silence wasn't just absence, it was a wound. The emulsion pulsed, and the walls of the cabin fristed, the corners stretching, the floorboards bending upward into a dome, the ceiling pressing down like a lid on a jar. The square footage wasn't expanding, it was folding. The space wasn't growing, it was swim breathing, inhaling, exhaling, and I was caught in its rhythm, my lungs compressing with each inhale, my ribs creaking under the pressure. The hissing from the mirror became a futram, a resonant percussion that vibrated through the cabin, not from the burn, but from the emulsion itself, as if the glass were a drumhead and something inside were beating against it. The black ooze reached the floorboards, and where it touched, the wood screamed, not a sound, but a sensation, a high, unnatural shriek that scraped against my teeth. The mold beneath the cabin's foundation began to furty weep, a slow, viscous seepage that climbed the walls in uneven blobs, the texture of overripe fruit, the color of bruised eggplant. It didn't spread. It removed it, slithering upward like a colony of insects, the air growing thick with the scent of fermentation, of something long dead and now turning. Silas was chasing the emulsion now, not through the walls, but through the walls. But tweety them! His form flickered, his edges jagged and incomplete, like a corrupted file. He didn't run. He tumbled, his body unraveling with each step, his fur shedding in clumps, his scars those intricate silvered lines peeling away like dead skin. The cabin's geometry was wrong. The angles were wrong. A door that had been 3 feet wide was now a slit, too narrow for a hand to pass through, and the floorboards beneath it sagged, not from weight, but from something pulling at them from below. The emulsion had reached the walls now, and the wood screamed again, a sound like tearing fabric, and the blobs of mold split open, revealing something wet and glistening beneath. Something that wasn't wood, wasn't mold, wasn't anything. I recognized. The lighter's flame guttered. The burn in the mirror was a wound, a gaping hole, and the emulsion was seeping through, not as liquid, but as twin pressure, as if the mirror were a sieve and the other side were sucking at it. The cabin's walls impulsed, the wood expanding, contracting, the grain splitting apart as if the very structure were trying to exhale. The sound of the emulsion's hiss was now a furor, a resonant percussion that filled the cabin, not from the mirror, but from the walls, from the floor it itself. The mold had reached the ceiling now, and the blobs had burst, raining down in slow, sticky droplets, the impact soundless, the texture like wet parchment. Silas was gone, not vanished, not disappeared. His purr were gone. The silence wasn't just absence, it was a forte presence, a hollow echo that filled the cabin, a sound that wasn't a sound, that pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. The emulsion had reached the center of the cabin now, and the floorboards' food split open, not from impact, but from something twin-pushing, from below something that wanted out. The blobs of malt free moved, slithering toward the mirror, the texture of overripe fruit, the color of bruised eggplant, and the air grew thick with the scent of fermentation, of something long dead, and now turning the lighter's flame died. The burn in the mirror was a wound, a gaping hole, and the emulsion was seeping through, not as liquid, but as the crusher, as if the other side was sucking at it. The cabin's walls, spine-pulsed, the wood expanding, contracting, the grain splitting apart as if the very structure were trying to exhale. The sound of the emulsion's hiss was now a furor, a resonant percussion that filled the cabin, not from the mirror, but from the walls, from the floor, shell itself. And then the click, not a sound, a feeling. The cabin's walls soon stopped pulsing. The emulsion stopped oozing. The mold stopped moving. The silence wasn't just absence anymore. It was Sophie complete. The lighter's flame was gone. The burn in the mirror was a wound, a gaping hole, and the emulsion was gone. The cabin's walls were still. The floorboards were still. The air was so still. And Silas's purr died in the cabin's echo. The floorboards were no longer wood. They had become something slick and yielding, like the underside of a mushroom cap after a storm warm, damp, fore-breathing. My fingers sank into the surface as I pressed them against the wall. The grain no longer grain, but something trivially pulsing with a slow, wet rhythm. The cabin wasn't shrinking. It was two-folding, not outward but inward, like a collapsed lung, and the air inside was thick with the scent of overripe plums left too long in the sun, their flesh splitting open to reveal the rot beneath. The walls weren't just warped, they were wrong, the angles stuttering like a film reel skipping, the seams between planks unraveling into jagged, uneven edges that bled a syrupy amber, thick as honey but with the consistency of wet ash. Silas's paws made no sound. They didn't run across the floorboards, they sank into them, his claws leaving behind half-moons of that same amber goo which bubbled where it touched the air. His body wasn't mangy anymore. It wasn't twit anything. His edges flickered like a corrupted signal, his fur shedding in clumps that didn't fall but dissolved, dissolving into the wall as if he were being absorbed by it. The ritual scars, those deliberate silvered lines, weren't scars anymore. They were open, splitting like wounds. And from them oozed the same thick, viscous fluid, not red, but the color of bruised figs, dark and sweet and funrung. The emulsion from the mirror wasn't spreading. It was spreading. It ate the walls, the floor, the very air between us, and where it touched, the wood screamed. Not a sound, but a vibration in my teeth, a high, unnatural whine that made my fillings ache. The peripheral movement was worse now. It wasn't just in the corners of my vision, it was sooty inside. My vision, a flicker at the edge of my gaze, something that darted when I tried to focus, something that laughed when I turned away. The rain hadn't stopped. It scraped, not against the roof, but against the footwalls. The droplets hitting the surface with a sound like wet metal being dragged across stone, each one leaving behind a fine powdery residue that clung to my skin like pollen. My hand was already halfway through the wall before I realized I'd moved. The wood wasn't solid anymore. It was purrs, like sponge cake left too long in the sun, and my fingers sank into it without resistance, the texture shifting beneath my touch from rough to slick to finrong. Something that wasn't wood, wasn't wall, wasn't weigh anything. I recognized. The amber goo pulsed in time with my pulse, a slow, wet heartbeat that filled the cabin, and the air grew thick with the scent of fermenting fruit, the kind of rot that doesn't stink but taste, sweet on the back of the tongue. The floorboards beneath me fristed, not from weight, but from something twin-pulling at them from below. Something that wanted out. Silas wasn't chasing the emulsion. He was twin-feeding. His body was unraveling, not in pieces, but in fusillia, his fur peeling away like dead skin, his scars splitting open to reveal the same dark, pulsing fluid beneath. He didn't look at me. He didn't. We need to. His eyes were locked onto the wall, onto the emulsion, onto the thing that was eating the cabin from the inside out, and his purr gone, not silent, not absent, gone like a note that had been played and never recorded, like a shadow that had been erased. The silence that filled the cabin wasn't empty. It was soft-hungry, a void that pressed against my ears, against my skin, against the soffit walls of my own skull. The peripheral movement was closer now. It wasn't in the corners of my vision anymore. It was behind me, a flicker of motion that darted when I turned, a shape that left when I tried to catch it, something that wasn't a person, wasn't an animal, wasn't Tweety anything I could name. The rain scraped harder, the droplets hitting the wall with a sound like wet paper being torn, each one leaving behind a fine, sticky residue that clung to my skin like syrup. The cabin was folding in on itself. The walls pressing inward, the floorboards twisting upward, the ceiling pressing down like a lid on a jar, and I was caught in the middle of it, my lungs compressing with each inhale, my ribs creaking under the pressure. My hand was up to the wrist now, sinking into the wall, the texture shifting beneath my touch from rough to slick to sudrong. Something that wasn't wood, wasn't wall, wasn't anything. The amber goo pulsed in time with my pulse, a slow, wet heartbeat that filled the cabin, and the air grew thick with the scent of fermenting fruit, the kind of rot that doesn't stink but tastes sweet on the back of the tongue. The floorboards beneath me twisted, not from weight, but from something pulling at them from below, something that wanted out. And then nothing, not silence, not absence, nothing. The cabin stopped folding. The wall stopped weeting. The peripheral movement vanished. The rain stopped. The amber goo solidified, hardening into something that wasn't wood, wasn't wall, wasn't anything, and my hand was caught in it, up to the wrist, the texture shifting beneath my touch from slick to fonrong, something that wasn't liquid, wasn't solid, wasn't anything. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was soity complete, a void that filled the cabin, a sound that wasn't a sound, that pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, and Silas was gone. The text arrived as a jolt, a physical tremor in the air, then Fouche and Rome's golden age glitched. It's your fault! The words materialized on the screen of my antique typewriter, a stark white intrusion against the aged parchment. I hadn't typed them. The machine hadn't moved. The air tasted of something acrid, like burnt almonds, and something else, something metallic and wrong. Silas scratched at his face, a frantic, almost desperate gesture. His movements were jerky, unnatural. He didn't purr. He hadn't purred in what felt like an eternity. His fur, once a patchy, sickly grey, seemed to ripple with a heat I couldn't feel, a shimmering distortion that made the edges of his form blur against the warped walls of the cabin. A cluster of his whiskers detached, not falling but dissolving into the amber-stained wood. The sound was a faint, brittle crackle, like dry leaves crumbling underfoot. Outside, the rain intensified. It wasn't falling, it was just scraping against the cabin, a relentless metallic rasp that resonated deep within my bones. It sounded like metal dragged across stone, a discordant symphony of corrosion. Each droplet left behind a residue, a fine powdery film that coated the windows, obscuring the already impenetrable darkness beyond. The air grew heavy, saturated with the scent of overripe plums and something else. Something that clung to the back of my throat, a sweetness that bordered on putrescence. I turned to the mirror. It wasn't reflecting the cabin anymore. It wasn't reflecting nothing recognizable. It showed a scene, a tableau of decaying grandeur. Roman columns, crumbling and overgrown with sickly vines. Statues, their faces eroded by time, and something else, something that seemed to consume the stone. And then I saw myself, older, worn. My face, a mask of despair, my eyes hollow pits of terror. Above my head, hovering like a malevolent halo, was Silas's head. But it wasn't Silas, it was something wrong, a distorted parody of his feline form, its eyes burning with a cold, predatory intelligence. The image pulsed, a sickly green light radiating from it, and I felt a wave of nausea, a visceral certainty that the scene wasn't a reflection, but a prediction. The plum light thickened, pressing down on me, a physical weight that stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't just light, it was a presence, a palpable thing that oozed from the walls, from the floor, from the very fabric of the cabin. The texture of the walls shifted beneath my fingertips. No longer wood, but something slick and yielding, something that pulsed with a slow, wet rhythm. I could feel it, a heartbeat not my own. A heartbeat that resonated with the dread that coiled in my gut. Another text. "Tom, they know!" The words appeared on the screen, faster this time, as if the machine was struggling to keep up with the frantic urgency of the message. My fingers trembled as I reached for the silver mirror, intending to smash it, to destroy the image that haunted my every waking moment. But as I lifted it, the emulsion within seemed to writhe, to breathe. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a portal, a window into something else. Silas moved then, not with a pounce, not with a playful swat, but with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. He didn't chase the emulsion, he fought on it. His body was unraveling, not in pieces, but in layers. The mangy fur sloughing off in clumps. The ritual scars splitting open to reveal the same dark, viscous fluid that pulsed beneath the amber stains. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He didn't need to. His entire being was focused on the swirling iridescent pool within the mirror, and the air thrummed with a silent, desperate hunger. The typewriter clacked, a frantic mechanical counterpoint to the scraping rain and the pulsing light. The anchor is failing. The words appeared. A final, chilling message. I felt a shift, a subtle alteration in the very fabric of reality. The cabin groaned, a low guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones. The plum light intensified, swallowing the cabin in a suffocating embrace. And then, with a sound like wet paper tearing, the mirror sucked Silas's head into the emulsion. Not gently, not gradually, but with a violent, instantaneous force. His form twisted, elongated, then vanished, leaving behind only a ripple in the iridescent surface. The silence that followed was absolute, a void so complete it felt as if it were pressing against my eardrums, threatening to shatter them. The cabin held its breath. The plum light dimmed, just slightly, and I was left alone in a space that was no longer familiar, no longer safe. The text on the typewriter screen flickered, then vanished, leaving only the blank, expectant parchment. The typewriter key struck the paper with a final hollow. The tule, not a clack. No, it was something deeper, something that vibrated through the desk and into my bones, a sound like a fist pressing into wet clay. The words appeared before the key could retract. "You understood the thought." No blinking. No hesitation. The letters were already there, inkless but vivid, as if burned directly into the parchment, their edges jagged like the teeth of a saw. I didn't move. My fingers hovered above the keys, the air between them thick with the scent of overripe figs fermenting in a sealed jar. The cabin groaned, a slow, deliberate exhalation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Silas's body was a mess of unraveling fur and raw, glistening scars. His limbs twitched, not from fear, but from something far worse purpose. His claws, blackened and brittle, dug into the warped wood of the floorboards, sending up curls of amber dust that caught the sickly light like embers in a dying fire. The mirror's surface shimmered, not with reflection, but with a slow, viscous and breathing, the emulsion pulsing like a living thing. I could see my arm in it, distorted, the skin stretched too tight over bone, the veins blackened and swollen with something that wasn't blood. The stench of rotten fruit thickened, pressing into my sinuses, the sweetness of it cloying, almost sweet like the flesh of a peach left too long in the sun, the flesh splitting open to reveal the maggots writhing beneath. Then he moved. Silas didn't lunge. He didn't hesitate. His body coiled, not like a cat preparing to strike, but like a spring unspooling, his spine arching backward with a sound like dry parchment tearing. His paw, no, not his paw, his hand hardened, because it wasn't a paw anymore. Not really, not since the first time the scars had split open and the dark fluid had oozed out. His hand struck the mirror with a force that should have shattered glass. Instead, the emulsion fundiv, and his arm, his whole arm, was pulled into it, not inch by inch, but with a sudden violent secoué, as if the mirror were a wound and his flesh the blood being drained. The sound was wet, obscene, like the last gulp of a drowning man, a glop that echoed through the cabin, bouncing off the walls in a way that made my teeth ache. The peripheral movement flickered then, just for a second. A shape, not human, not animal, something that moved in the corner of my eye like a shadow cast by a light that wasn't there. I turned. Nothing, just the warped walls, the peeling wallpaper, the typewriter keys gleaming dully in the dim light. But when I looked back, the mirror's surface was wrong. The emulsion had split, not cracked, but T-field like the skin of a bruise, and beneath it, if I squinted, if I leaned into it, I could see the cabin again, or what passed for it. The floorboards were slick with something that wasn't water, the walls pulsing with a slow wet whiff. And Silas was still there, or at least his torso was, his upper body writhing against the edge of the mirror, his mouth open in a soundless scream, his teeth, not claws, gnashing against the glass as the rest of him was dragged into the dark. The typewriter keys clacked then, a single, deliberate stroke, as if the machine were typing itself. The paper fed forward, the inkless words appearing with a speed that made my head spin. The anchor is failing! The letters blurred, not from motion, but from the way the air itself seemed to futhrop. The cabin pressing in around me, the walls shifting, the floorboards groaning like a dying thing. The stench of rotten fruit was everywhere now, thick and suffocating, and I could taste it, metallic and sweet, like the inside of a mouth that had been left to rot. The mirror's surface twitched, and for a second I saw him, not Silas, not the thing that had been Silas, but something else entirely, something tall and emaciated, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in blackened talons. It smiled, or at least its mouth split open in what might have been a smile, and then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. The last thing I heard was the typewriter. A single final twang-clack. The keys rose and fell slow and deliberate, as if something were typing out a message that would never end. The cabin held its breath. The mirror held its breath. And I was left with the sound of my own heartbeat, a frantic, erratic thing that echoed through the silence, a sound that wasn't mine, that couldn't be mine, because the thing that had been Silas was still typing, and the words were coming, and the cabin was wrong, and the air was thick with the scent of something dying. And the typewriter clacked on, and on, and on. The text arrived as a vibration against my skull. Not a chime, not a buzz, but a direct pressure against bone. Dead. I didn't need to look at the screen. The message had already imprinted itself onto the back of my eyelids, a smear of black against the bruised plum of the perpetual rain. My thumb moved before I consciously willed it, a jerky, automatic action. Delete, 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 delete. Each swipe across the screen felt less like an act of control and more like a desperate attempt to scrub something off my skin. The messages vanished, one by one, but the feeling of them, the weight of the words, the intent behind the sender remained, clinging to the inside of my skull like cobwebs. A dull ache bloomed behind my eyes, and the silence that followed wasn't relief, but amplification. The typewriter, of course, hadn't stopped. It clacked again, a single, isolated strike, then another, and another, the sound oddly precise, mechanical, as if a small insistent insect were hammering at the foundations of the cabin. I didn't bother looking. I already knew what it was typing. It always knew. The floorboards beneath my feet began to hum, a low subsonic thrum that resonated in my teeth. It wasn't a sound I so much as felt, a vibration that traveled up my spine and settled in the base of my skull. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it grew, intensifying with each passing moment until the entire cabin seemed to tremble, a skeletal frame rattling in the wind. The mangy sphynx, its skin stretched taut over bone, sat perched on the back of the armchair, its ritual scars, the dark geometric patterns etched into its flesh glowing faintly in the dim light. It hadn't purred in hours. No, its throat emitted a sound like the rasp of dry leaves skittering across pavement, a brittle hollow rattle that mirrored the tremor in the floorboards. Its gaze, unwavering, fixed on some point beyond the walls, beyond the rain, beyond everything. It was assessing, calculating, as if it knew something I didn't, or more accurately, as if it knew Shudin Mai better than I knew myself. The light, or what passed for it, had shifted. The earlier illumination, that sickly, overripe plum, was fading, replaced by a viscous darkness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It wasn't a lack of light, but an absorption of it, as if the cabin were consuming everything around it, swallowing it whole. I could feel the darkness pressing against my skin, a cold, clammy weight that stole the air from my lungs. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with the force of 1,000 fists. But it wasn't just rain anymore, it was something else, something thicker, heavier, that poured through the gaps in the roof, cascading down the walls like liquid mold. It smelled of decay, of rotting fruit and wet earth, a cloying sweetness that turned my stomach. The ceiling groaned, a slow, agonizing protest, and a thin trickle of the dark liquid began to run down the wall, leaving a glistening trail that pulsed with a faint, internal light. I pressed my back against the warped wood of the cabin wall, trying to anchor myself to find some semblance of solidity in a world that was rapidly dissolving around me. But the wood was soft, yielding as if it were made of clay. I pushed harder, and my hand sank into the wall, my fingers disappearing into the damp, rotting timber. The sensation was revolting, like plunging my hand into a wound. The typewriter fooshed-clacked again, a relentless, mechanical rhythm that filled the silence. The sound wasn't coming from the machine anymore. It was coming from inside my head. Footsteps echoed slow and deliberate, pacing a rhythm that didn't align with my heartbeat. They weren't outside the cabin. They weren't even in the room with me. They were inside my skull, reverberating against bone, a phantom cadence that drove me to the edge of madness. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It was everywhere, inside, outside, all around. Then a shift. A subtle contraction, a tightening as if the cabin were shrinking, squeezing me, compressing me. The walls pressed in, the ceiling lowered, and the floorboards buckled beneath my feet. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the stench of decay intensified, filling my lungs, coating my tongue with a metallic sweetness. I opened my eyes. My hand, the one that had sunk into the wall, was still there, but it was wrong. The skin was stretched too tight, translucent, and the veins beneath the surface were swollen, pulsing with a dark, viscous fluid. The cabin continued to contract, the walls closing in, and I felt a strange, irresistible pull, a force that drew me forward towards the split in the mirror. My hand reached for it, drawn by an unseen current, and the dark, slick surface of the glass beckoned. The text arrived like a punch, not a message. Fooey world's ending. My thumb moved before I could think, swiping across the screen with a fushik that echoed in the silent cabin. The messages vanished, but the words lingered, branded onto my retinas, glowing against the rotting plum of the perpetual rain. The floorboards beneath me began to groan, their ancient timbers complaining under the sudden weight of the black deluge pouring through the ceiling. It wasn't just water anymore. It was liquid mold, thick and viscous, oozing down the walls like decay made manifest. The cabin shuddered with each impact, its bones creaking as if in protest. The mangy sphynx on the armchair twitched its scarred tail, a sudden movement that drew my gaze. Its ritual scars pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows onto the rotted wallpaper behind it. It wasn't purring anymore. Instead, its throat rattled with a dry, brittle sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. The cabin grew colder as the darkness seeped in from every corner, consuming what little light remained. The air was thick with damp and despair, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. I could feel it on my tongue, too, that metallic sweetness of decay, cloying and revolting. A drip echoed through the room, loud as thunder in the oppressive silence. Then another, and another, each one falling into rhythm with a relentless pounding of rain against the roof. The sound was wrong, discordant, like a broken metronome ticking away the seconds to some impending doom. My hand reached out, drawn by an unseen force towards the window. My fingers left streaks on the rotting wallpaper, their tips tinged with that same sickly plum hue. I could feel it too, the faint vibration of madness beneath my skin, a throbbing pulse that mirrored the rhythm of those sudra drips. The window frame was slick with mold, blistered tomato red, oozing down like blood from some unseen wound. The glass itself was opaque, streaked with grime and condensation. Yet I could still see it, the peripheral movement, always there but gone when looked at directly. I crawled towards the window, my heart pounding in time with those sun-drips see. My hand reached for the frame, fingers sinking into the slick, yielding mass of mold. It felt alive under my touch, pulsing with a sickening rhythm that seemed to echo from within me. As I leaned closer to peer through the grimy glass, something twitched at the edge of my vision, a shadow moving where there should be none, slipping just out of sight as soon as I tried to focus on it. My breath fogged up the window, leaving trails like tears streaming down the cold pane. Then a twitch, a sudden movement that made me jump. The mangy sphynx's scarred tail twitched against the glass, its tip brushing against something unseen in the empty space beyond the cabin wall. And then it was gone. The shadow, the peripheral movement swallowed up by an emptiness so profound it seemed to bleed into my very soul. I pressed my forehead against the cold pane, feeling the weight of that void pressing back at me from the other side. The world outside didn't just feel wrong. It felt Tyventy, as if all life had been leached away until nothing remained but this rotting cabin and whatever madness lay beyond its decaying walls. But there was something else too, a whisper barely audible over the pounding rain and echoing drips, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A chorus of voices raised in unison, chanting words I couldn't quite understand, but felt resonate deep within me nonetheless. World's ending. World's ending. World's ending. The typewriter freak-lacked againical rhythm now indistinguishable from my own heartbeat. Echoing the same refrain. World's ending! The text arrived like a punch, not a message. You're the glitch. My thumb moved before thought, swiping the screen with a fishhook that echoed in the cabin's wet silence. The words vanished, but the meaning stayed, branded into my retinas like a fresh bruise. The rain outside had changed. It no longer fell with a footing plink on the roof, but tasted like cold iron in my mouth. I could feel it on my tongue, a sharp metallic tang that cloyed like old blood left in the sun. The cabin smelled of damp rot, the air thick with decay pressing against my skin like a physical weight. I turned toward the window, the rotten plum of the walls pressing against my back. The mangy sphynx should have been there, its scarred tail twitching on the armchair. But the chair was empty. Only the faint scent of old fur lingered, a ghost of what had been. I called out, my voice swallowed by the cabin's silence. No dry rattle of dead leaves answered, just the oppressive stillness. Then the cabin shuddered. A deep, resonant crack ran diagonally through its heart, splitting the walls apart like rotten wood pulled apart by unseen hands. The split opened wide, revealing a darkness that wasn't the outside, a void swallowing the cabin's light. The rain stopped falling. The silence was absolute, thick and suffocating, pressing in like a fist. My hand moved on its own, drawn by the pull of the void within the split. I reached in, fingers sinking into the cool, yielding air. It felt like reaching into a cold river, the water pulling me deeper. The rain had ceased, but the air still held the memory of its fall, and then from the corner where the sphynx should have been, a sound, the dry, brittle rasp of a purr. But it was wrong, tinny, thin, like a frayed wire sparking weakly before dying. It wasn't coming from the cat. It was coming from the rain itself, pulled into the air. I watched as the sound began to fade, pulled from the rain like smoke from a dying ember. The purr weakened, its rhythm stuttering until it was gone. The rain was gone. The silence was absolute. The cabin stood split, breathing. The Sphinx's purr was gone. The rain was gone. The silence was the only thing left. I stood there, my hands still reaching into the void, the taste of iron in my mouth, the silence pressing in from all sides. The cabin's walls were split, but the real wound was inside me. The feeling of being a glitch in a world that no longer fit. The rain had stopped. The purr had stopped. In that silence, the world ended. The split widened, not with a sound, but with a slow, sickening, unfurling, like a wound opening wider. And in that unfurling, I realized the rain hadn't just stopped. It had been sucked out, leaving only the echo of that dry, brittle sound fading into nothing. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the absence of the purr, the absence of rain, the absence of everything. And the cabin, split like a rotten fruit, held its breath. The rain had stopped. The purr had stopped. In the silence, the world ended.